The dagger came out of nowhere. One moment, Alpha King Damien Ashworth stood at the center of the great hall with his hand raised to accept the ceremonial crown, and the next moment, a servant near the eastern pillar dropped his tray and pulled a blade from beneath his sleeve. The sound of metal sliding free cut through the music, and for a heartbeat, nobody in the hall understood what they were seeing. Then the man lunged. Damien twisted his body just in time, and the blade sliced through the air where his neck had been a second earlier. Gasps rippled through the crowd of nobles, pack leaders, and warriors who had gathered from every corner of the kingdom to witness this moment. The ceremony that was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era had turned, in an instant, into something else entirely. Near the back of the hall, standing quietly with a pitcher of water in her hands, a young maid named Lyra felt her whole body go still. She had noticed something wrong minutes earlier, long before the first blade was drawn, but no one had listened to her. No one ever listened to a maid. The hall itself was a masterpiece of stone and light. Tall windows lined the eastern wall, letting in soft golden sunlight that fell across polished marble floors. Silver banners bearing the crest of the Ashworth pack hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in the breeze from the open doors. Rows of chairs had been arranged for the guests, filled with important faces from every allied territory. At the front, on a raised platform, stood the throne where Damien was meant to sit once the crown touched his head. It was supposed to be the safest room in the entire kingdom. Warriors lined the walls. Trusted advisors stood near the platform. Every guest had been checked at the door. And yet here they were, watching their king fight for his life. The first attacker recovered quickly from his missed strike, and came at Damien again, blade low, aiming for the ribs this time. Damien caught the man's wrist and twisted hard, but before he could finish the move, a second figure emerged from the crowd near the western entrance, then a third from behind one of the stone pillars, then a fourth from among the seated nobles themselves, and finally a fifth, dropping down from a balcony that overlooked the hall. 5 attackers, all moving toward the same target, all perfectly timed. This was not random. This was planned. Screams erupted across the hall as guests scrambled to get away from the platform. Chairs toppled over. A noblewoman in a deep blue gown tripped over her own skirts and was pulled to safety by a stranger. Somewhere near the doors, a young boy called out for his mother, his voice swallowed by the chaos. Damien's personal guards, 6 of them stationed around the platform, rushed forward the instant the second attacker appeared. But something was wrong with their response. They moved half a second too slow, as if they had been expecting something else, some smaller disturbance, not this. Lyra saw it immediately. The guards were good. She had watched them train in the courtyard many mornings while she hung laundry near the barracks. They were fast, strong, and well-trained, but they were not trained for this. 5 coordinated attackers striking from 5 different directions at the exact same moment was not the kind of threat anyone had prepared them for. She set the water pitcher down slowly on a side table, her eyes never leaving the platform. The first guard reached the platform and engaged the man who had first drawn his blade. Steel met steel with a sharp ring that echoed off the high ceiling. The guard was strong, but the attacker moved with unusual precision, as if he had rehearsed this exact fight 100 times before. Within seconds, the guard was pushed back, stumbling over the edge of the platform. 2 more guards arrived to face the second and third attackers, but they too found themselves struggling. These were not ordinary assassins hired off the street. Their movements were too clean, too practiced, too calm. Whoever had sent them had spent a great deal of time and resources preparing for exactly this moment. Damien himself was no ordinary man. As Alpha King, he carried strength and speed far beyond that of a normal person, and he used both now, ducking beneath a strike from the 4th attacker and driving his shoulder into the man's chest hard enough to send him stumbling backward into the crowd. But even a king has limits, especially when facing 5 skilled opponents at once with no weapon of his own. The 5th attacker, the one who had dropped from the balcony, circled around behind Damien while his attention was fixed on the man in front of him. Lyra's fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had spent 2 years in this castle, keeping her head down, doing her work quietly, never drawing attention to herself. She scrubbed floors, carried water, folded linens, and disappeared into the background the way a good maid was supposed to. Nobody asked her questions, nobody looked at her twice. That was exactly how she had wanted it. But watching the 5th attacker close in on the king's unprotected back, something inside her shifted. She was not the only servant in the hall who noticed. Near the front, an older manservant named Edmund had frozen in place, his tray of empty cups shaking in his hands. A younger maid named Clara had already fled toward the side doors, pulling 2 young children from a noble family along with her, doing what she could to get them to safety. That was the right thing to do. That was what a maid was supposed to do in a moment like this. protect the innocent and stay out of the way of warriors and kings. Lyra knew that, and yet her feet did not move toward the doors. Instead, she found herself watching the fight unfold with a strange, sharpening focus, the kind of focus she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She noticed the way the third attacker favored his left leg, ever so slightly, when he shifted his weight. She noticed the small pause the second attacker took before every strike, a habit that would get him hurt against the right opponent. She noticed the exact moment the fifth man's foot would leave the ground as he prepared his final approach toward the king's back. She noticed all of this without meaning to, the way some people notice the color of the sky without ever choosing to look up. One of the guards went down hard, struck across the shoulder, and did not get back up. A second guard was thrown from the platform entirely, crashing into a row of empty chairs. The remaining 4 guards were spread too thin, each locked in their own struggle, unable to help the king or each other. The crowd's screaming had turned into a kind of frozen horror. Some guests had made it to the doors. Others stood rooted in place, unable to look away from the sight of their future king, fighting for his life in front of them. Near the platform, a nobleman named Gareth Whitlock stood with his hand pressed against his chest, his face pale as he watched the chaos unfold. He had traveled 3 days to attend this ceremony, eager to see the new Alpha King crowned, eager to be seen standing close to power on such an important day. Now he simply wanted to survive it. Damien managed to knock the 4th attacker to the ground, but the effort cost him. He was breathing hard, his movements slowing just slightly, the kind of slowing that a trained eye could catch immediately. Blood trickled from a shallow cut along his forearm, though he seemed barely aware of it, his focus locked entirely on the threat still standing. The 5th attacker made his move. He came from behind, silent and fast, his blade angled for a strike that would end everything. The remaining guards were too far away to reach him in time. The crowd could only watch. Even Damien, locked in his own struggle with the 3rd attacker, had no way of seeing what was coming for him. For one terrible second, it seemed certain that the ceremony meant to crown a new king would instead become the day that King died. And then something happened that no one in that hall expected. A tray clattered to the floor. Lyra moved. She crossed the distance to the platform faster than anyone would have believed a maid capable of moving, her steps light and controlled, her body low and balanced in a way that spoke of training, real training, the kind that took years to build and that no ordinary servant would ever have reason to learn. She reached the 5th attacker just as his blade began its final downward arc toward the king's exposed back. Time seemed to slow for the handful of people close enough to see clearly what happened next. Lyra's hand shot out and caught the attacker's wrist mid-strike, redirecting the blade's path away from Damien with a small, precise twist of her arm. Her other hand came up in a sharp motion that struck the man across the side of his knee, and his leg buckled beneath him. The attacker stumbled, momentarily thrown off balance, and turned his attention away from the king and toward this unexpected new obstacle standing in his path. A simple maid, in a plain gray dress, with her hair tied back and flowers still dusting one sleeve from the morning's kitchen work. He must have thought this would be easy. He was wrong. Damien, catching a glimpse of movement from the corner of his eye, turned just enough to see what was happening behind him, and what he saw made him forget, for just a moment, about the attacker still in front of him. The king's future, his safety, and everything about to unfold in the next several minutes would hinge on choices made in the seconds that followed, choices made not by trained warriors or seasoned guards, but by a quiet young woman who had spent 2 years making sure nobody in this castle ever looked at her twice. That was about to change. The hall held its breath, gasps of confusion mixing with the ringing echo of steel, as everyone present tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed. A maid had stepped between the king and death itself. Whether she would survive the next few moments was a question that hung heavy in the air, unanswered, as the 5th attacker regained his footing and turned to face her fully for the first time. His eyes narrowed. Hers did not waver. The attacker lunged again, faster this time, clearly unwilling to be embarrassed twice by someone he had dismissed as harmless. His blade came in low and fast, aimed at Lyra's side, a strike meant to end the fight before anyone could question what they had just seen. Lyra sidestepped without hurry, as though she had all the time in the world, and caught his forearm as it passed her. She turned her hips and used his own momentum against him, sending him crashing face first into one of the stone pillars that lined the hall. He hit the ground and did not immediately rise. The entire hall had gone quiet, in a way that felt almost louder than the screaming had been moments before. Every eye that could see the platform was now fixed on the maid standing over the fallen attacker, her breathing calm, her stance loose and ready. Damien turned fully now, forgetting for a moment the 3rd attacker still circling him. his eyes fixed on Lyra with something between shock and disbelief. He had walked past this woman in the castle halls more times than he could count. He had never once looked at her twice. She was simply part of the scenery, one face among dozens of servants who kept the castle running smoothly behind the scenes. He had never imagined she moved like that. The third attacker took advantage of the king's split second of distraction and pressed his attack, forcing Damien to snap his focus back to the fight in front of him. Steel rang out again as their blades, well, in Damien's case his forearm guard, met in a fast exchange of strikes and blocks. Near the edge of the platform, the second attacker had finally broken free of his struggle with one of the guards, knocking the man aside with a heavy blow to the chest. He turned, searching for his next target, and his eyes landed on Lyra. She noticed him coming before he had taken 2 steps. Without hesitation, she moved to intercept him, putting herself between this new threat and both the king and the fallen guard who was struggling to rise nearby. The attacker, seeing what he assumed was another easy target, raised his blade and came at her directly. He learned quickly that he was mistaken. Lyra ducked beneath his first strike and drove her elbow into his ribs with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. As he doubled over, she brought her knee up sharply, and he staggered backward, gasping, his blade slipping from fingers that had suddenly lost their strength. A nobleman standing near the edge of the crowd, a middle-aged man named Peter Hollis, found himself unable to look away from what he was witnessing. He had seen trained warriors fight in tournaments before, seen guards spar in courtyards, seen soldiers drill for battle. He had never seen anyone move quite like this maid was moving, with such economy, such calm precision, as though every strike had been planned 3 moves in advance. Near the western entrance, the guards who had been stationed to protect the doors finally arrived at the platform, having fought their way through the panicked crowd trying to escape. They arrived just in time to see the second attacker fall, clutching his ribs, and to see the maid turn calmly toward the third man still exchanging blows with the king. One of the newly arrived guards, a broad-shouldered man named Callum, called out to Lyra, his voice thick with confusion. "Who are you?" he asked, though there was no time for her to answer, and in truth, she did not seem inclined to try. She was already moving toward the king. Damien and the third attacker were locked in a fierce exchange, the attacker's blade flashing again and again, as Damien blocked and countered with his bare forearms, refusing to give ground, despite the growing exhaustion clear in his movements. This attacker was clearly the most skilled of the 5, his footwork precise, his strikes calculated to exploit every small opening. Lyra approached from the side, moving low and quiet, and the attacker, sensing her presence at the last possible second, tried to pivot to face this new threat, while still keeping his blade trained on the king. It was the wrong decision. Splitting his attention between 2 opponents gave Damien the opening he needed. He caught the attacker's wrist and forced the blade downward and away, and in that same instant, Lyra swept her leg low, catching the man's ankle and pulling his balance completely out from under him. The third attacker hit the marble floor hard, his blade skittering away across the polished stone. That left only the fourth and first attackers, the fourth still on the ground where Damien had thrown him earlier, slowly trying to push himself back to his feet, and the first, who had briefly regrouped near the edge of the platform after his initial failed strike. The first attacker looked around at his fallen companions, at the maid standing calm and ready beside the king, at the guards now converging from every direction, and made a decision that would define the rest of his short time in that hall. He turned and ran. He did not get far. 2 guards who had been stationed near the main doors intercepted him before he reached the exit, tackling him to the ground and pinning his arms behind his back despite his struggling. The fourth attacker, seeing his last remaining ally captured, seemed to lose whatever resolve had brought him to this hall in the first place. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, signaling surrender, and the nearest guard moved cautiously to restrain him. Silence spread through the great hall like water soaking into stone, broken only by scattered whispers and the ragged breathing of everyone who had just witnessed something they would be talking about for years to come. Damien stood in the center of the platform, chest heaving, blood still trickling from the cut along his forearm, staring at the maid who had just helped save his life not once, but multiple times in the span of a few frantic minutes. Lyra, for her part, seemed almost embarrassed by the attention now turning toward her. She straightened her simple gray dress, tucked a loose strand of hair back behind her ear, and took a small step backward, as though she might still be able to slip quietly back into the crowd and disappear the way she always had before. It was too late for that now. The nobleman named Peter Hollis was the first to break the stunned silence, his voice carrying across the hall as he asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Who is she?" he said, looking from Lyra to the king and back again. "That is not the fighting of a simple maid. Whispers rippled outward from where he stood, spreading through the crowd like fire through dry grass. Guests turned to their neighbors, exchanging confused and astonished glances, all of them trying to make sense of what they had just seen. A servant, someone who by all appearances had spent her days scrubbing floors and carrying water, had just single-handedly defeated 3 trained attackers and helped subdue the other 2. Damien took a slow step toward her, his expression unreadable. A mixture of gratitude, confusion, and something else that he himself did not yet have a name for. "Lyra," he said, his voice quiet but carrying easily in the silent hall. "That was your name, was it not?" She met his gaze steadily, neither looking away nor stepping further back, though every instinct she had built over the past 2 years screamed at her to disappear, to vanish into the crowd, to go back to being invisible. That part of her life, she realized with a strange, sinking certainty, was over now. "Yes, Your Majesty," she answered simply. Around them, guards were binding the hands of the captured attackers. Guests were slowly beginning to move again, some rushing to check on injured friends and family, others still frozen in shock at what the ceremony meant to celebrate a new king had instead become. The captured men were being led away toward the castle's lower levels, where they would be questioned about who had sent them and why. But the biggest question in the room, the one on every single face turned toward the platform, had nothing to do with the attackers at all. It had everything to do with the quiet maid who had just revealed, in front of the entire kingdom, that she was very far from ordinary. The great hall, once filled with music and celebration, now echoed with the low murmur of shaken voices and the sharp orders of guards trying to restore some kind of order. Overturned chairs littered the floor. A torn banner hung crookedly from one of the high windows, its silver thread catching the afternoon light in a way that felt strangely out of place given everything that had just happened. Damien had not moved from where he stood on the platform. His forearm still bled, though he had barely acknowledged it, his attention fixed entirely on the woman standing a few feet away from him. A healer named Miriam pushed her way through the crowd, her bag of supplies already open in her hands, and immediately reached for the king's injured arm. "Let me see that, Your Majesty," she said firmly, in the tone of someone who had tended enough wounds to know that kings were no different from anyone else when it came to needing care. Damien allowed her to examine the cut, though his eyes never left Lyra. "It is not deep," Miriam announced after a moment, already pulling clean cloth from her bag. "You were fortunate." "Fortunate," Damien repeated quietly, a faint and humorless smile touching the corner of his mouth. He turned his head slightly to look at the captured attackers being marched toward the lower levels of the castle, their wrists bound tightly behind their backs. Fortune had very little to do with what happened here today. Around the hall, guards were working quickly to account for everyone. 2 of the king's personal guards had been seriously injured. One struck across the shoulder badly enough that he had to be carried out on a makeshift stretcher. The others, though bruised and shaken, had escaped with lighter wounds. No guests appeared to have been harmed, though several had fainted from shock and needed help getting to their feet. Near the edge of the platform, Callum, the broad-shouldered guard who had first called out to Lyra during the fight, stood watching her with an expression that mixed suspicion and reluctant respect in equal measure. He had served the Ashworth Pack for nearly 6 years, had trained under some of the best warriors in the kingdom, and he had never seen anyone move the way this maid had moved during the fight. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he finally asked, his voice low but clearly audible to those standing nearby. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, though her face remained calm. "That is not something I wish to discuss here," she said carefully. Her answer did nothing to satisfy the growing crowd of onlookers, many of whom had begun edging closer, curiosity overpowering their earlier fear. Nobles who moments ago had been scrambling for the exits now found themselves drawn back toward the platform, eager to catch a glimpse of the mysterious maid at the center of this unfolding drama. Gareth Whitlock, the nobleman who had traveled 3 days to attend the ceremony, pushed his way to the front of the gathering crowd, his earlier fear replaced now by open fascination. "Extraordinary," he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear. "Absolutely extraordinary. I have never in my life seen a servant fight like a trained warrior." Several other nobles murmured their agreement, and the whispers began to grow louder, spreading through the hall like ripples across still water. Some voices carried admiration, praising the bravery of a simple maid who had risked her life for the king. Others carried something closer to suspicion, questioning how someone with no known history of combat training could possibly move with such skill and precision. Damien raised a hand, and the murmuring quieted almost instantly, though the tension in the room remained thick enough to feel. "Clear the hall," he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone born to command. "Let the healers tend to the injured. Let the guests return to their quarters. This ceremony will be addressed properly once we understand what has happened here today." Guards moved quickly to usher the remaining guests toward the exits, gently but firmly encouraging the crowd to disperse. Some left willingly, still shaken and eager to put distance between themselves and the scene of such violence. Others lingered as long as they could, unwilling to miss a single detail of the unfolding mystery. As the hall slowly emptied, Damien finally turned his full attention to Lyra, who stood quietly near the edge of the platform, her hands folded in front of her, her posture that of a servant awaiting instruction, rather than someone who had just fought off multiple trained attackers. "You saved my life today," he said simply, "more than once." "I did what needed to be done, Your Majesty," she replied, her voice steady but carefully neutral. Damien studied her for a long moment, taking in details he realized he had never truly noticed before despite passing her countless times in the castle halls. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and sharp, watchful eyes that seemed to take in everything around her, without appearing to look directly at anything at all. "That is not the answer of a maid," he said finally. "That is the answer of a soldier." Lyra did not respond to that observation, though something flickered briefly across her expression, gone too quickly for Damien to identify exactly what it had been. Nearby, Miriam finished bandaging the king's arm and stepped back, gathering her supplies. "You should rest, Your Majesty," she said, though there was little conviction in her voice, as though she already knew he had no intention of resting anytime soon. Damien ignored the suggestion entirely. His focus remained on Lyra, and on the dozens of unanswered questions now swirling through his mind. 5 attackers moving with coordinated precision, striking during the most important ceremony of his life, and in the middle of it all, a maid whose fighting skills rivaled or perhaps exceeded those of his own trained guards. This was no longer simply about surviving an assassination attempt. This was about understanding who had orchestrated it, and understanding exactly who this woman standing before him truly was. Captain Edric, the head of the king's personal guard, approached the platform, his expression grim as he gave his report. "2 of the attackers are dead, Your Majesty," he said quietly, careful to keep his voice low enough that only Damien and those closest could hear. "Casualties from their own attempts to resist capture. The other 3 are secured in the lower cells, though none of them have spoken yet." Damien nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "Question them thoroughly," he instructed. "I want to know who sent them, and I want to know before the end of this day." "Understood, Your Majesty," Edric replied, though his eyes drifted briefly toward Lyra with obvious curiosity, before he turned to carry out his orders. As the hall continued to empty, Damien found himself alone with Lyra and a small handful of trusted guards, the earlier chaos slowly settling into something more manageable, though the questions hanging in the air remained just as pressing as before. "I need you to come with me," Damien said, his tone leaving no room for argument, though he tried to soften it slightly with the addition of a single word, "Please." Lyra hesitated for just a moment, her eyes flickering toward the exits as though calculating whether escape was still a viable option. Whatever calculation she made, she ultimately chose not to run. Instead, she gave a small nod of agreement, falling into step beside him as he made his way toward the private chambers reserved for matters requiring discretion. Behind them, the great hall stood in disarray, a physical reminder of how close disaster had come to unfolding on what was meant to be one of the most celebrated days in the kingdom's history. Broken chairs, scattered flowers, and dark stains marking the marble floor told a story that would spread throughout the kingdom within hours, carried by every guest who had witnessed the attack firsthand. The story of the Alpha King, who had nearly died on his coronation day. And the story of the quiet maid who had stepped forward at the last possible moment, revealing a hidden skill that would change the course of everything that followed. The private chamber Damien led her to was smaller than the great hall, though no less impressive, with tall bookshelves lining one wall and a large window overlooking the castle gardens on the other. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the room despite the tension that filled the air between the 2 people standing within it. Damien gestured toward a chair near the fire, though Lyra remained standing, her hands still folded in front of her in the posture of a servant even now, even after everything that had just happened. "Sit," he said, more gently this time. She hesitated, then finally lowered herself into the offered chair, though her posture remained straight and alert, nothing like the relaxed ease most people showed when finally given permission to rest. Damien remained standing, pacing slowly in front of the fire as he tried to organize the flood of questions competing for attention in his mind. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her directly. "Tell me who you really are," he said. Lyra met his gaze steadily, though something behind her eyes seemed to be weighing carefully how much to reveal. "I am exactly who the castle records say I am," she answered slowly. "A maid named Lyra, employed here for the past 2 years." "That is not what I asked," Damien replied, his patience clearly beginning to wear thin despite his efforts to remain calm. "I asked who you really are. No maid moves the way you move today. No servant disarms trained killers with the ease you showed in that hall." Lyra's jaw tightened slightly, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, staring into the fire as though searching for the right words among the flickering flames. "I had training once," she finally admitted, her voice quieter now. "A long time ago. Before I came here." "What kind of training?" Damien pressed. "The kind that teaches a person to survive when survival is not guaranteed," she answered, carefully vague, revealing just enough to satisfy the question without actually answering it. Damien studied her for a long moment, recognizing the careful evasion for exactly what it was. He had grown up surrounded by advisors and nobles skilled in the art of saying much while revealing little, and he could recognize the same technique now, even coming from someone who claimed to be nothing more than a simple servant. A knock interrupted the tense silence, and Captain Edric entered at Damien's call, his expression grave. "Your Majesty," he said, glancing briefly at Lyra before continuing. "One of the attackers has spoken." Damien's attention sharpened immediately. "And?" "He claims they were hired," Edric continued, "paid a significant sum to ensure the ceremony did not proceed as planned. He would not name who hired them, only that the payment came through an intermediary, someone who never revealed their face." "That is convenient," Damien said, frustration clear in his voice. "There is more," Edric added, his tone growing even more careful. "He mentioned that the coordination of the attack, the precise timing, the knowledge of the ceremony's schedule, and the positioning of the guards, that information came from someone within the castle itself. Someone with access to details that should have been known only to your closest advisors." The room fell silent for a long moment as the implications of this revelation settled over everyone present. "Someone within my own court arranged this," Damien said slowly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "It appears so, Your Majesty," Edric confirmed. Lyra remained quiet throughout this exchange, though Damien noticed her posture had shifted subtly, her attention now fully engaged rather than simply enduring the conversation as a servant might. She was listening carefully, absorbing every detail, her mind clearly working through the implications just as actively as his own. "Who else knew the details of the ceremony's schedule?" Damien asked, turning back to Edric. "The council," Edric answered. "The senior advisors, a handful of trusted guards responsible for security arrangements, and of course myself." "That narrows things considerably," Lyra said quietly, speaking for the first time since Edric had entered the room. Both men turned to look at her, and she continued, her voice growing slightly more confident now that the conversation had shifted toward something practical rather than personal questions about her past. "Whoever arranged this needed detailed knowledge of the ceremony," she said. "They needed to know the exact positioning of the guards, the timing of the crown presentation, and likely the layout of the hall itself well enough to place attackers at strategic points without arousing suspicion beforehand. That is not information a random conspirator could easily obtain. That points toward someone with genuine access to your inner circle." Damien found himself nodding slowly, recognizing the sharp, analytical way she had just broken down the situation. It was not the observation of a simple maid. It was the observation of someone trained to think tactically, to analyze threats and identify vulnerabilities with a clarity that came only from real experience. "You speak like someone who has planned such things herself," he observed carefully. Lyra's expression flickered again, that same brief glimpse of something hidden beneath the surface. "I speak like someone who has survived such things," she corrected quietly. "There is a difference." Before Damien could press further, another knock sounded at the door, and a young guard entered, looking pale and shaken. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice unsteady. "The attacker who spoke, the one being held separately for further questioning. He is dead." Damien's expression darkened immediately. "Dead how?" "Poison, Your Majesty," the guard answered. "Something in his water. We found him only moments ago." The room fell into another heavy silence as this new piece of information settled over everyone present. Whoever had orchestrated this attack was not finished. They had eliminated a witness who had begun talking, someone who could have led investigators directly to them, and they had done so with an efficiency that suggested resources and reach extending well beyond a simple group of hired attackers. "This conspiracy runs deeper than we realized," Edric said grimly. Damien turned back toward the window, staring out at the peaceful gardens below, a stark contrast to the danger now clearly surrounding him from within his own castle walls. Someone close to him, someone trusted enough to know the intimate details of castle security, had arranged an assassination attempt and was now moving swiftly to cover their tracks. He needed answers, and he needed them quickly, before whoever was responsible could strike again. He turned back to face Lyra, studying her closely. "Whatever your past truly is," he said slowly, "you clearly possess skills and instincts that could prove valuable in uncovering whoever is responsible for this. I am asking you to help me find them." Lyra's expression remained carefully composed, though Damien could see the calculation happening behind her eyes as she weighed this request. Helping the king investigate a conspiracy within his own court meant stepping further into the light, further away from the anonymity she had clearly worked hard to maintain for the past 2 years. But refusing was no longer truly an option, not after everything that had already been revealed in that great hall. "I will help you, Your Majesty," she said finally, "but I have conditions of my own." Damien raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised by her boldness, though something about her directness seemed to earn a measure of respect rather than offense. "Name them," he said. Lyra took a slow breath before continuing, clearly choosing her words with great care. "Whatever you learn about my past during this investigation," she said, "stays between us until I decide otherwise. And you do not ask me to reveal more than what becomes necessary to solve this conspiracy." Damien considered her request for a long moment, recognizing the careful boundary she was drawing, protecting whatever secrets remained buried in her history, while still offering genuine help with the immediate crisis facing his kingdom. "Agreed," he said finally. Something in Lyra's posture relaxed slightly at his answer, though the tension in the room remained thick with unanswered questions. Outside the chamber window, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the castle grounds, a fitting reflection of the shadows now spreading through every corner of the court itself. The investigation into who had orchestrated the attack on the Alpha King was only just beginning, and already it was clear that the answers would not come easily, nor would they come without further danger for everyone involved. News of the poisoned attacker spread through the castle within hours, and by the following morning, the entire court was buzzing with speculation about what it all meant. Servants whispered in the kitchens, guards exchanged worried glances during their patrols, and in the Grand Council chamber the kingdom's most senior advisors gathered for an emergency meeting that Damien had called at first light. The council chamber was a circular room lined with tall windows, a long wooden table stretching across its center, where 7 advisors sat waiting for the king to arrive. Each of them held positions of significant influence within the kingdom, overseeing everything from military strategy to trade agreements with neighboring territories. Damien entered with Lyra a step behind him, and the moment the two of them appeared together, a ripple of surprise passed through the gathered advisors. It was highly unusual, to say the least, for a king to bring a servant into a private council meeting, and the raised eyebrows around the table made that reaction plain enough. An elderly advisor named Edwin Barlow, who had served 3 generations of the Ashworth pack, was the first to speak, his voice carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being heard. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "may I ask why this young woman has been brought into a meeting of such sensitivity?" "Because she may prove essential to solving it," Damien answered simply, taking his seat at the head of the table, while Lyra remained standing quietly near the wall behind him. Murmurs spread around the table, several advisors exchanging skeptical glances. A woman named Rosalind Fairweather, who oversaw the kingdom's treasury, spoke next, her tone carefully measured but clearly doubtful. "With respect, Your Majesty, we have just survived an assassination attempt planned by someone with intimate knowledge of this court's inner workings. Bringing an unknown servant into our discussions seems, if I may say so, unwise." "She is not unknown," Damien replied evenly. "She saved my life yesterday, more than once, while 5 of you sat frozen and several of my own trained guards struggled to respond effectively. I would say that earns her a place at this table, or at least in this room." The chamber fell silent for a moment, several advisors shifting uncomfortably at the pointed reminder of their own limitations during the crisis. Edwin cleared his throat, choosing his next words more carefully than his first. "Perhaps, Your Majesty," he said, "we should focus on the matter at hand. We have confirmed that the attack was coordinated using detailed knowledge of the ceremony's security arrangements, and that the informant among the captured attackers was silenced before he could reveal his employer. This suggests quite clearly that someone within this very room, or someone close to it, may bear responsibility." That accusation hung heavy in the air, and Damien watched carefully as each advisor's expression shifted in response, searching for any hint of guilt or discomfort that might betray the truth. Rosalind's expression tightened with obvious offense. "Surely you do not mean to suggest one of us arranged this," she said sharply. "I mean to suggest nothing yet," Edwin replied calmly. "I merely state the facts as we understand them. Someone with access to sensitive information was involved. That circle of access includes everyone in this room." The accusations and counter-accusations that followed filled the chamber for several minutes, advisors defending themselves and casting suspicious glances toward one another, the tension in the room thickening with every passing exchange. Damien allowed the discussion to continue for a while, watching closely, before finally raising a hand to silence the room. "Enough," he said firmly. "Accusations without evidence accomplish nothing. What we need is a methodical investigation, conducted quietly, without alerting whoever is responsible that we are closing in on them." He glanced back toward Lyra, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, observing everyone at the table with the same sharp, analytical focus she had shown during the fight in the Great Hall. "Lyra," he said, "do you have any observations to share?" All eyes turned toward her, several advisors clearly uncomfortable at the idea of a servant offering input on matters of state security. Lyra, however, seemed entirely unbothered by their skepticism, stepping forward slightly as she began to speak. "The attackers were skilled," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Not common criminals hired for coin, but trained fighters, likely former soldiers or mercenaries, with real combat experience. That kind of talent does not come cheap, and hiring 5 of them simultaneously would require significant resources. Whoever arranged this has considerable wealth at their disposal, or access to it." Several advisors exchanged glances at this observation, clearly reassessing their initial dismissal of her presence in the room. She continued, "The poisoning of the captured attacker also required precise timing and access to the lower cells, which are not easily reached without proper authorization. Whoever silenced him either holds a position of genuine authority within this castle, or has someone working for them who does." Edwin leaned forward slightly, his earlier skepticism replaced now by genuine interest. "That does narrow the possibilities considerably," he admitted. "Very few individuals hold both the wealth necessary to hire skilled attackers and the authority required to access the lower cells undetected." "Precisely," Lyra said. Rosalind, still visibly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, spoke up again, though her tone had softened slightly. "And how exactly does a castle maid come to understand such matters so clearly?" Lyra met her gaze evenly, offering no additional explanation beyond what she had already provided. "I have seen conspiracies before," she said simply. "I know how they take shape." The vague answer clearly frustrated several advisors, but Damien intervened before the questioning could continue further, redirecting the conversation back toward practical matters. "I want a full accounting," he said, addressing the entire council. "Every individual who had access to the ceremony's detailed schedule, every guard assigned to the lower cells during the time of the poisoning, and every financial transaction of unusual size processed through this castle within the past month. I want this information gathered quietly and reported directly to me, no one else." The advisors nodded their agreement, though the tension in the room remained palpable as the meeting drew to a close. One by one, they filed out of the chamber, casting curious and wary glances toward Lyra as they departed, clearly uncertain what to make of this mysterious young woman, who had so quickly found herself at the center of the kingdom's most pressing crisis. As the last advisor left the room, Damien turned to Lyra, studying her expression carefully. "You made yourself several enemies in that room today," he observed. "I made myself several people who will underestimate me less than they did an hour ago," she corrected. "Whether that counts as enemies or not remains to be seen." Damien allowed himself a small, tired smile at that response, the first genuine moment of levity since the attack had occurred. "Perhaps you are right," he said. Outside the tall windows of the council chamber, the castle grounds stretched out beneath the morning sun, gardeners tending to flower beds and guards patrolling the walls with visibly heightened alertness following the previous day's events. Life within the castle was attempting to return to some semblance of normalcy, though everyone who had witnessed the attack, or heard the stories now spreading rapidly through every corridor, understood that nothing would feel entirely safe again until the person responsible was found. As Damien and Lyra left the council chamber together, neither of them noticed the pair of eyes watching them carefully from a shadowed alcove further down the corridor, eyes belonging to someone who understood far more about the conspiracy unfolding within these walls than anyone in that meeting could have guessed. The investigation had only just begun, but already, the true danger facing the kingdom was proving to be far more complicated, and far closer to home, than anyone had initially realized. 3 days after the council meeting, A traveling merchant named Nathaniel Cross arrived at the castle gates, seeking an audience with the king, claiming to carry information relevant to the recent attack. Guards escorted him cautiously through the courtyard, wary of any new threat given the tension that still gripped the castle, though a quick search revealed nothing more dangerous than a small satchel of trade documents and a well-worn traveling cloak. Damien received him in a smaller meeting room, with Lyra standing quietly nearby, as had become her habit whenever matters related to the investigation were being discussed. Nathaniel, a lean man with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed little, bowed respectfully before speaking. "Your Majesty," he began, "I have traveled through many territories in my years as a merchant, and I have heard many stories along the way. When word reached me of the attack during your ceremony, and of the maid who fought off 5 trained attackers with such remarkable skill, I felt compelled to come and see for myself whether the stories held any truth." Damien's brow furrowed slightly. "And what stories are those?" Nathaniel's gaze shifted toward Lyra, studying her carefully for a long moment before continuing. "Years ago," he said slowly, "in the northern territories far from here, there existed a group of warriors known by very few outside their own ranks. They called themselves the Silver Wolves, an elite group trained not for the glory of battle, but for quiet, precise work, protection details, recovery of stolen goods, occasionally the elimination of threats too dangerous for ordinary soldiers to handle." Lyra's posture had gone very still, her expression carefully blank in a way that Damien had come to recognize as a sign that something important was being discussed. "The Silver Wolves disappeared many years ago," Nathaniel continued. "Their compound was destroyed, and most who called it home were believed to have died in the destruction. Rumors persisted for a time that a small number survived and scattered, disappearing into ordinary lives across various territories, hiding their true skills and their true history from everyone around them." Damien turned to look at Lyra, whose expression had not changed, though her hands had curled slightly at her sides. "Is this true?" he asked quietly. Lyra remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the question hanging heavily in the room. Finally, she let out a slow breath, as though releasing something she had carried for a very long time. "It is true," she admitted quietly. Nathaniel's expression showed no surprise, only quiet confirmation of what he had apparently already suspected. "I thought as much," he said. "The way the stories described your movements during the attack, the precision, the calm under pressure. Only someone trained by the Silver Wolves would fight with such discipline." Damien's mind raced through the implications of this revelation. A group of elite warriors, trained for exactly the kind of covert protection work that had just saved his life, and Lyra had been part of it, hiding that history for the past 2 years while working as an ordinary castle maid. "Why did you hide this?" he asked, his voice carrying more curiosity than accusation. Lyra's jaw tightened as she considered her answer carefully. "Because those who destroyed the Silver Wolves' compound did so intentionally," she said finally. "It was not an accident, nor was it the result of some rival group's aggression. It was orchestrated, carefully planned, by someone who wanted our group eliminated entirely because of who we protected and what we knew." The room fell silent as Damien absorbed this new information, recognizing immediately how it might connect to the very conspiracy he was currently trying to unravel. "Who did you protect?" he asked. Lyra hesitated, clearly weighing how much to reveal even now. "We were hired, at various times, to protect individuals whose safety threatened certain powerful interests," she said carefully. "Nobles who opposed corrupt dealings, merchants who refused to participate in illegal trade, occasionally members of ruling families who found themselves at odds with those seeking to seize power through less honorable means. That sounds remarkably similar to the situation you now find yourself protecting me from," Damien observed slowly. Lyra met his gaze directly. "It does," she agreed. Nathaniel, who had remained quietly observing this exchange, spoke up again, his expression thoughtful. "If I may offer an observation, Your Majesty," he said. "Whoever destroyed the Silver Wolves' compound clearly possessed significant resources and was willing to eliminate an entire group of highly trained warriors to protect their own interests. If that same individual, or someone connected to them, is now responsible for the attack during your ceremony, it would suggest a pattern of behavior spanning many years, someone patient and resourceful enough to pursue their goals across a long period of time." Damien turned this possibility over in his mind, recognizing the disturbing implications it carried. This was not simply a single ambitious conspirator seeking quick power within his court. This might be someone who had been quietly building influence and eliminating threats for years, patiently positioning themselves for exactly this kind of opportunity. "Do you have any idea who was responsible for destroying your former group?" he asked Lyra. She shook her head slowly. We searched for years afterward, she admitted. Those of us who survived. We found fragments of information, hints pointing toward someone with connections spanning multiple territories, someone with both wealth and influence extending into royal courts. But we never found conclusive proof, and eventually, most of us scattered, choosing to hide rather than continue a search that seemed increasingly dangerous and unlikely to succeed. Is that why you came here? Damien asked. To this castle. To hide. Lyra nodded slowly. I sought a quiet life, away from anything that might draw attention, she said. I never expected the search for whoever destroyed my former life would eventually lead directly to your court. Nathaniel cleared his throat gently. If your enemy and the king's enemy are indeed the same person, he said, then perhaps your paths crossing here was not simply coincidence. Perhaps whatever forces are at work sensed the danger you posed to their plans, wherever you settled, and that danger followed you here, threatening the king simply because your paths happened to intersect. The theory hung heavy in the room, an unsettling possibility that added new layers of complexity to an already tangled conspiracy. Damien found himself studying Lyra with renewed appreciation, understanding now that her presence in his castle carried far greater significance than simple chance. Thank you for bringing this information forward, Damien said to Nathaniel. Your assistance will not be forgotten. Nathaniel bowed respectfully before taking his leave, and once the door closed behind him, Damien turned back to Lyra, who stood staring out the window with an expression heavy with old grief and renewed determination. I am sorry, he said quietly, for the loss of your former companions. Lyra turned to face him, her eyes carrying a depth of sorrow that suggested years of carrying this burden largely alone. Thank you, she said simply. We will find whoever is responsible, Damien said firmly, for both of us. Lyra studied him for a long moment, something shifting slightly in her expression. A small measure of trust beginning to form where wariness had previously dominated. For the first time since the attack, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Together, then, she said quietly. Together, Damien agreed. Outside the window, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the castle grounds, and somewhere within those walls, the person responsible for orchestrating both the destruction of the Silver Wolves years ago and the recent attack during the coronation ceremony continued moving unseen, unaware that their carefully hidden identity was slowly, steadily, being uncovered by two people who now shared a common purpose and a common enemy. A week passed with no further attacks, though the castle remained tense, every servant and guard moving through their duties with an alertness that had not existed before the ceremony. Damien had ordered a quiet investigation into the financial records of every senior advisor, hoping to uncover any unusual transactions that might point toward who had funded the attack. Lyra spent much of that week working alongside Captain Edric, reviewing guard schedules from the day of the ceremony and cross-referencing them against the movements of castle staff. It was tedious work, far removed from the dramatic fight that had first revealed her hidden skills, but she approached it with the same careful precision she brought to everything else. On the 7th day, she found something. Captain Edric, she said, spreading several documents across the table in the small records room where they had been working. Look at this. Edric leaned over the papers, following her finger as she traced a pattern across several different logs. The guard rotation on the day of the ceremony, she explained, was changed less than an hour before the event began. Here, on this schedule, you can see the original assignments, and here, on this second document, filed only minutes before the ceremony started, several guards were reassigned to different positions. Edric's brow furrowed as he studied the documents more closely. That is unusual, he admitted. Guard rotations are rarely changed so close to a major event, especially one involving the king's personal safety. Precisely, Lyra said, and look at whose signature authorized the change. Edric squinted at the small, hurried signature scrawled at the bottom of the reassignment order, and his face went pale as recognition dawned. Vincent Ashcombe, he read aloud, his voice tight with disbelief. The master of castle security. Lyra nodded slowly. He would have had every reason to know the ceremony schedule in intimate detail, she said, and he would have had the authority to reassign guards without raising immediate suspicion. If he wanted certain positions left vulnerable or certain guards moved away from key locations, this document would explain exactly how he accomplished it. Edric sat back heavily in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he absorbed this revelation. Vincent has served this castle for over a decade, he said slowly. He was trusted implicitly. I would never have suspected him. That is precisely why he was able to do this, Lyra observed. Trust creates blind spots. Whoever orchestrated this attack understood that perfectly, and either recruited Vincent specifically for his position of trust, or Vincent himself is the one behind everything. We need to inform the king immediately, Edric said, already rising from his chair. They found Damien in his private study, reviewing reports from the ongoing financial investigation, and the moment Lyra laid the guard reassignment documents before him, his expression darkened with the same disbelief Edric had shown moments earlier. Vincent, he said quietly, staring at the signature. He has served my family for years. My father trusted him completely. That trust may have been exploited, or it may have been misplaced from the very beginning, Lyra said carefully. Either way, this document proves he had both the knowledge and the authority necessary to weaken security at exactly the right moment. Damien set the papers down slowly, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. Bring him to me, he said, quietly. I want to question him myself before word spreads that we suspect anyone. Edric nodded and left immediately to carry out the order, leaving Damien and Lyra alone in the study. If he is responsible, Damien said quietly, staring out the window toward the castle grounds below, then he may also be connected to whoever destroyed your former group all those years ago. It is possible, Lyra agreed, though we should not assume too much before we have his own account of events. Nearly an hour passed before Edric returned, his expression grim. Your Majesty, he said, Vincent Ashcombe cannot be found. His quarters are empty, and several of the castle staff report seeing him leave through the eastern gate late last night, carrying travel bags as though preparing for a lengthy journey. Damien's expression hardened further. He fled, he said flatly. It would appear so, Edric confirmed. Lyra moved to the window, staring out toward the eastern road that stretched away from the castle toward the surrounding countryside, her mind already working through the implications of this new development. If he fled last night, before we even discovered the guard reassignment records, she said slowly, then he must have suspected the investigation was closing in on him, which means someone informed him of our progress. Damien turned to look at her sharply. You believe there is another informant within the castle? It would explain the timing perfectly, Lyra said. We only just found these documents today. For Vincent to have already fled last night, he would need advance warning that his role in the attack was at risk of being discovered. The implications of this settled heavily over the room. Not only had they identified one conspirator connected to the attack, but there appeared to be at least one more person within the castle actively working to protect Vincent, or perhaps protecting someone even more important standing behind him. Send riders after him immediately, Damien instructed Edric. I want him found and brought back for questioning, whatever it takes. Edric nodded and hurried from the room to organize a search party, leaving Damien and Lyra once again alone with the weight of this new complication settling over them both. This conspiracy runs deeper than a single ambitious man seeking personal gain, Lyra observed quietly. Whoever is truly behind this has resources extending throughout your castle, enough influence to warn a co-conspirator of impending discovery and help him escape before we could act. Damien nodded slowly, his expression grave. Then we are not simply hunting one traitor, he said. We are hunting whoever stands behind him, someone patient enough and powerful enough to orchestrate all of this from the shadows while keeping their own hands clean. The same person responsible for destroying the Silver Wolves, Lyra said quietly, almost to herself. Perhaps, Damien agreed, though we still lack proof of that connection. Outside the study window, the sun was beginning to set over the castle grounds, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. A beautiful sight that felt strangely at odds with the growing danger and uncertainty gripping everyone within these walls. Somewhere beyond the castle, Vincent Ashcombe was fleeing into the countryside, carrying with him answers that could unravel the entire conspiracy. If only he could be found before whoever controlled him decided he had become too great a liability to leave alive. And somewhere within the castle itself, another conspirator remained hidden, watching, waiting, and undoubtedly already calculating their next move now that their carefully laid plans had begun to unravel. The search party found Vincent Ashcombe 2 days later, hiding in a small trading town several hours' ride from the castle, attempting to purchase passage on a merchant vessel bound for distant shores. He offered no resistance when the guards surrounded him, his earlier confidence replaced entirely by the resigned posture of a man who understood his attempt to disappear had failed. He was brought back to the castle in chains and placed in a secure holding room, separate from the general cells where the surviving attackers from the ceremony remained imprisoned. Damien insisted on questioning him personally, with Lyra and Captain Edric standing nearby as witnesses. Vincent sat at a small wooden table, his hands bound in front of him, his once immaculate appearance now disheveled from days of travel and capture. He looked up as Damien entered the room, his expression carrying a mixture of shame and something that looked almost like relief. "You have questions," Vincent said quietly, before Damien could even speak. "I imagine I owe you answers." "I imagine you do," Damien replied, taking a seat across the table, while Lyra and Edric remained standing near the door. Vincent let out a long, tired breath. "I did not want to be involved in this," he said, "but I found myself with very few choices once the arrangement had already begun." "Explain," Damien said flatly. Vincent's eyes flickered briefly toward Lyra before returning to Damien. "3 years ago," he began, "my daughter fell seriously ill, a condition our castle healers could not treat. I was desperate, searching everywhere for a cure, and eventually I was approached by someone who offered to provide the rare medicine my daughter needed, in exchange for small favors related to castle security." "What kind of favors?" Damien asked. "Small things at first," Vincent said. "Information about guard schedules. Details about which nobles visited the castle and when. Nothing that seemed particularly dangerous at the time. My daughter recovered, and I believed my debt had been repaid." "But it was not repaid," Lyra said quietly from her position near the door. Vincent shook his head slowly. "No," he agreed. "The requests continued, growing gradually more significant over time, until eventually I found myself trapped, unable to refuse without risking exposure of everything I had already done. When the request came to adjust guard rotations for the coronation ceremony, I understood immediately what was being planned, but by then, I had no way to refuse without ensuring my own destruction, alongside whatever consequences would follow for the king." "Who approached you?" Damien asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Who is behind all of this?" Vincent hesitated, clearly weighing the danger of revealing this information against whatever fate awaited him regardless of his answer. "I never saw their face," he admitted finally. "All communication came through intermediaries, messages left in prearranged locations, payments delivered through channels that could not be traced back to any single individual. Whoever orchestrates this operates with extreme caution, ensuring that even those working for them, like myself, could never provide direct evidence of their identity." "That is remarkably careful planning," Lyra observed, suggesting someone with considerable experience avoiding exposure, likely because they have been operating this way for a very long time. Vincent nodded slowly. "I do know one thing, however," he said. "The intermediary who first approached me made a comment, in passing, about having handled similar arrangements in the Northern Territories some years ago. Something about cleaning up loose ends from an old operation that had grown troublesome." Lyra's expression sharpened immediately. "The Silver Wolves," she said quietly. Vincent looked at her with sudden recognition. "You know of them," he said. "I was one of them," Lyra replied. Vincent's eyes widened slightly at this revelation, several pieces clearly falling into place within his own understanding of the situation. "Then perhaps you understand better than anyone what kind of person we are truly dealing with," he said. "Someone patient, resourceful, and utterly ruthless when it comes to eliminating anything that threatens their long-term plans." Damien leaned forward slightly, his expression intense. "Is there anything else you can tell us?" he pressed. "Any detail, no matter how small, that might help identify who is truly responsible." Vincent thought carefully for a long moment before answering. "There was one other detail," he said slowly. "The intermediary mentioned, during one of our final exchanges, that their employer held a position close to royal courts. Someone who moved easily among nobility without arousing suspicion. They implied, though never stated directly, that this person had connections extending across multiple kingdoms, built over many years of careful positioning." "Someone within royal circles," Damien repeated slowly, the implications of this settling heavily over the room. "That narrows things considerably, though it still leaves a distressingly wide field of possibilities." Edric, who had remained largely silent throughout the questioning, finally spoke up. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if I may suggest, perhaps we should review the guest list from the coronation ceremony itself. Anyone who traveled specifically for that event, particularly anyone with connections to multiple territories, might warrant closer examination." Damien nodded slowly. "A reasonable place to continue our search," he agreed. He turned back to Vincent, studying the broken man before him with an expression that carried both anger and a measure of reluctant understanding. "What you have done nearly cost me my life," he said, "and nearly cost this kingdom its stability, but I recognize the position you found yourself trapped within." Vincent lowered his head, clearly bracing for whatever punishment awaited him. "Whatever consequences you decide are appropriate, Your Majesty," he said quietly. "I accept them." Damien rose from his seat, his expression unreadable. "Your fate will be decided once this conspiracy has been fully unraveled," he said. Cooperate fully in whatever remains of this investigation, and that cooperation will be remembered when the time comes for judgment. As Damien, Lyra, and Edric left the holding room, the weight of Vincent's testimony settled heavily over all three of them. Someone with connections across multiple kingdoms, someone comfortable moving among royal courts without suspicion, someone patient enough to have been orchestrating schemes for years without ever revealing their true identity. The guest list from the ceremony, Lyra said as they walked back through the castle corridors, would include dozens, perhaps hundreds of names. Narrowing that list to find our true culprit will require careful, methodical investigation. Then we begin immediately, Damien said firmly. Behind them, in the small holding room, Vincent Ashcombe sat alone with his thoughts, uncertain whether the information he had just provided would prove enough to finally expose the shadowy figure who had manipulated him so completely, or whether that same figure would find some way to eliminate this threat to their carefully guarded secret, just as they had eliminated the informant among the captured attackers days earlier. The conspiracy's true architect remained hidden, but the circle of possibility had narrowed considerably, and somewhere within that circle, someone was undoubtedly beginning to feel the first genuine stirrings of concern that their carefully constructed anonymity might finally be at risk of unraveling. For the next several days, Damien, Lyra, and Captain Edric worked through the guest list from the coronation ceremony with painstaking care, cross-referencing names against travel records, financial holdings, and any known connections to territories beyond the kingdom's borders. It was slow, careful work, made more difficult by the need for absolute discretion, since alerting the true mastermind to their progress could easily result in another disappearance, or worse. On the fourth day of this careful review, Lyra noticed something that made her pause. "Damien," she said, sliding a document across the table toward him. "Look at this travel record." Damien studied the paper carefully. It documented the movements of a nobleman named Gareth Whitlock over the past several years, showing frequent travel between at least 4 different territories, far more extensive than most nobles of his standing would typically undertake. "He claimed to have traveled 3 days specifically to attend my coronation," Damien said slowly, recalling the man's earlier comments in the Great Hall following the attack. Yet his travel records show him passing through territories that would place him nowhere near a direct route from his stated home, Lyra observed. "If he truly traveled from where he claims to reside, his path should have been far more direct." Edric leaned over the documents, frowning as he traced the same inconsistency Lyra had identified. "This suggests he was traveling from elsewhere entirely before arriving here," he said, perhaps concealing his true point of origin. Damien's mind flashed back to the moments following the attack, remembering Gareth's oddly calm fascination with Lyra's fighting skills, his eager questions, his lack of the same fear and panic that had gripped nearly everyone else in that hall. At the time, it had seemed like simple curiosity. Now, viewed through this new lens, it took on a far more unsettling quality. "He showed remarkable composure during the attack," Damien said slowly, "and afterward, considerable interest in exactly how Lyra had learned to fight the way she did. That could simply be genuine curiosity," Edric cautioned. "We should not build accusations on impressions alone." Lyra nodded in agreement, though her expression remained thoughtful. "We need concrete evidence," she said. "Financial records showing payments to the attackers, or communications linking him directly to Vincent or the intermediary he described." Over the following 2 days, working quietly and carefully to avoid drawing attention, they uncovered exactly that kind of evidence. A series of unusual financial transactions, routed through several intermediary accounts before ultimately connecting back to holdings controlled by Gareth Whitlock. Records showing correspondence, carefully coded but ultimately decipherable, between Whitlock and an unnamed contact discussing arrangements for services related to security matters at an unspecified royal event. "This is enough," Damien said finally, reviewing the accumulated evidence spread across his private study. "We have our answer." Lyra studied the documents once more before looking up at Damien. "There is something else," she said slowly. "I made inquiries about Whitlock's history, and I found references to a trading dispute from many years ago involving territories in the north, the same region where the Silver Wolves once operated. Whitlock lost considerable wealth and influence in that dispute, wealth and influence that my former group had been hired to protect on behalf of the merchants he sought to exploit." Damien's expression sharpened with understanding. "He blamed your group for his losses," he said, "and has spent years since rebuilding his influence and eliminating anyone connected to that old defeat," Lyra finished quietly, "including, eventually, my former companions, and now, it seems, extending his ambitions toward claiming influence over this kingdom as well." The pieces of the conspiracy finally fell into place. forming a clear picture of a patient, resentful man who had spent years quietly building wealth and connections while nursing old grievances, ultimately turning his attention toward destabilizing the Ashworth kingdom itself, likely hoping to position himself favorably once chaos created new opportunities for influence and power. "We move against him immediately," Damien said, his voice carrying the hard edge of someone who had finally identified the true threat to everything he cared about. Guards were dispatched quietly to Whitlock's quarters within the castle, where he had remained as a guest since the ceremony, apparently confident that his careful planning had left no trace leading back to him. When they arrived, however, they found the room already empty, Whitlock having apparently sensed the shifting winds of the investigation and fled sometime during the previous night. "He is gone," Edric reported grimly to Damien and Lyra, "slipped away before we could act." Damien's frustration was evident, though Lyra remained calm, already considering their next move. "He cannot have gone far," she said, "and a man of his wealth and visibility will struggle to disappear entirely, unlike Vincent, who had far less to lose and far fewer resources tying him to any particular location." Search parties were organized once again, this time with far greater urgency. Riders dispatched along every major road leading away from the castle, messages sent to allied territories requesting assistance in locating the fleeing nobleman. 2 days later, word arrived that Whitlock had been spotted at a border crossing, attempting to secure passage into a neighboring kingdom beyond the reach of Damien's direct authority. Damien himself led the party that intercepted him, arriving at the border crossing just as Whitlock was preparing to cross into territory that would have placed him beyond immediate consequence for his actions. Lyra rode alongside him, her expression calm and focused, ready for whatever confrontation awaited. Whitlock, seeing the approaching riders and recognizing immediately that his escape had failed, made no attempt to flee further. Instead, he turned to face them with a strange, resigned composure, the same eerie calm he had shown during the immediate aftermath of the attack in the Great Hall. "You found me sooner than I expected," he said as Damien and his party approached. "Your patience finally ran out," Damien replied coldly, dismounting from his horse. Years of careful planning, undone by a single traced financial record. Whitlock's expression showed no fear, only a kind of weary acceptance. "I suppose there is little point denying anything now," he said. "Why?" Damien demanded. "Why orchestrate all of this? What did you hope to gain?" Whitlock's gaze drifted briefly toward Lyra before returning to Damien. "Your father's allies destroyed my fortunes many years ago," he said, though there was less anger in his voice than simple exhaustion. "The Silver Wolves protected merchants who ruined me financially, cost me influence I had spent decades building. I lost everything that mattered to me, and no one, not your father, not any authority within this kingdom, offered any recourse or justice for what I had suffered. So you decided justice meant destroying an entire kingdom," Damien said flatly. "I decided that if the old order would not grant me what I deserved," Whitlock replied, "then I would build a new order myself, one where I held the influence and respect that had been stolen from me. By murdering innocent people," Lyra said, her voice carrying quiet anger. "By destroying an entire group of warriors who had done nothing more than protect people from your own exploitation." Whitlock's eyes flickered with something like recognition as he studied her more closely. "You truly were one of them," he said quietly. "I suspected as much, watching you fight during the ceremony. Very few outside that group ever moved with such precision." The guards accompanying Damien moved forward to restrain Whitlock, and he offered no resistance, allowing himself to be bound without protest, his earlier composure finally giving way to something closer to defeat. "It is over," Whitlock said quietly, almost to himself, as the guards led him toward a waiting cart that would carry him back to the castle for judgment. "Whatever else happens now, at least it is finally over." As the party made its way back toward the castle, Whitlock secured and silent within the cart, Damien rode alongside Lyra, both of them quiet for a long while as the weight of everything that had happened settled over them. "It is finally finished," Damien said eventually. Lyra nodded slowly, though her expression carried a complicated mixture of relief and lingering grief for everything and everyone lost along the way to this resolution. "Finished," she agreed quietly. "Though nothing that was lost can truly be returned." Damien reached over, placing a gentle hand briefly on her shoulder, a small gesture of comfort and solidarity after everything they had endured together over the past several weeks. "No," he agreed softly, "but perhaps something new can still be built from what remains." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, something warm and hopeful flickering behind her carefully guarded eyes for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. "Perhaps," she agreed quietly. Ahead of them, the castle came into view on the horizon, its towers catching the golden light of the setting sun, standing tall and secure once more now that the true threat to its stability had finally been captured and brought to justice. Gareth Whitlock's trial took place 2 weeks later, in the very same great hall where the coronation ceremony had descended into chaos so many weeks earlier. This time, the hall was filled not with celebration or terror, but with the quiet, solemn atmosphere of a kingdom seeking justice and closure after a difficult chapter in its history. Whitlock offered no defense against the overwhelming evidence presented: the financial records, the correspondence, the testimony from Vincent Ashcombe, who had cooperated fully throughout the remainder of the investigation. The council, after careful deliberation, sentenced Whitlock to permanent exile, stripped of all titles, wealth, and influence, sent to live out his remaining years in a remote territory, far from any position of power or authority. Vincent Ashcombe, whose cooperation had proven instrumental in identifying Whitlock's true role in the conspiracy, received a lighter sentence, removed from his position as master of castle security, but spared imprisonment in recognition of the desperate circumstances that had led him into Whitlock's manipulation, and his eventual willingness to help set things right. As the trial concluded and the great hall slowly emptied, Damien remained standing near the platform, watching as guards led Whitlock away for the final time. Beside him, Lyra stood quietly, her expression thoughtful as she watched the man who had caused so much devastation finally face consequences for his actions. "It does not undo what was lost," she said quietly. "No," Damien agreed, "but it ensures no further harm comes from what he built." In the days that followed, the castle slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though many things had changed irrevocably since the day of the failed coronation ceremony. Guards trained with renewed dedication, having witnessed firsthand how quickly complacency could be exploited. Council members approached their duties with greater caution and transparency, wary of ever again allowing such a dangerous conspiracy to take root within their ranks. And Lyra, the quiet maid who had spent 2 years working to remain unnoticed within the castle walls, found that such invisibility was no longer possible, nor did she particularly wish for it any longer. Damien called her to his study one final time, several weeks after Whitlock's trial had concluded, the autumn sunlight streaming warmly through the windows as she entered. "I have made a decision," he said, as she took her now familiar seat near the fire. "What decision is that?" she asked. "You saved my life," he said, "not once, but many times over these past weeks, both through combat and through the sharp instincts you brought to uncovering this entire conspiracy. A kingdom is fortunate to have even one person with such skill and dedication. I would be foolish to allow such talent to return to scrubbing floors and carrying water." Lyra's expression carried a hint of amusement at this description of her former duties. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "I am naming you captain of my personal guard," Damien said, "a position that recognizes both your skill and the trust I have come to place in you these past weeks. You would oversee my personal protection and hold authority to train the guards under your command according to whatever methods you believe necessary to prevent anything like this from happening again." Lyra sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the weight of this offer. It was everything she had spent years trying to avoid, a position of visibility and authority that would make hiding from her past entirely impossible. And yet, after everything that had happened, after finally confronting the shadow that had haunted her for so long, she found that the prospect no longer filled her with the same fear it once might have. "I accept," she said finally. Damien smiled, genuine warmth replacing the careful formality that had often characterized their interactions during the tense weeks of investigation. "I am glad," he said. As autumn gave way to winter, the castle settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by the lessons learned from the crisis that had nearly claimed the king's life. Lyra threw herself into her new role with the same quiet dedication she had once brought to her work as a maid, training the guards under her command with patience and skill, earning their respect gradually through demonstrated competence rather than simply the authority of her title. Damien, for his part, found himself increasingly drawn to her company, beyond the formal requirements of her new position, seeking her counsel on matters both large and small, appreciating the sharp, clear thinking she brought to every challenge facing the kingdom. On a cold evening several months after the trial, as snow fell gently outside the castle windows, Damien found Lyra standing on a balcony overlooking the gardens, watching the snowfall with a peaceful expression, quite different from the wary alertness that had once defined her every waking moment. "You seem at peace," he observed, joining her at the railing. "For the first time in a very long while," she admitted. "I spent so many years running, hiding, waiting for the past to catch up with me. Now that it finally has, and has been dealt with, I find myself uncertain what to do with all this quiet." "Perhaps," Damien suggested gently, You simply allow yourself to enjoy it. Lyra turned to look at him, something warm and genuine in her expression that had been slowly growing since the day Whitlock had finally been captured. Perhaps I will, she said quietly. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall softly over the castle grounds. Two people who had been brought together through violence and conspiracy, but who had found in each other something far more valuable than either had expected. A partnership built on trust, respect, and the shared experience of facing danger together and emerging stronger for it. The kingdom, once nearly shattered by a hidden conspiracy years in the making, moved forward under the guidance of a king who had learned the value of looking beyond assumptions, and a former warrior who had finally found a place where her skills and her true self could exist openly rather than hidden away in fear. The maid who had once been invisible now stood as one of the most trusted and respected figures within the entire kingdom, her hidden skill no longer a secret to be guarded, but a strength that had helped save a king, expose a conspiracy years in the making, and ultimately, build the foundation for something neither of them had expected to find on what was meant to be a simple coronation day. The story of the 5 attackers and the maid who revealed her hidden skill would be told for years to come throughout the kingdom, a reminder that true strength often hides in the most unexpected places, waiting quietly for the moment it is truly needed.